All right, part two of this um, really just gets kicked off with a couple wars. Um, I put some images on the right side there of the same location before and after. It's specifically World War II, but um, then also some interesting footage of World War One there on the link, just in case you're interested with that, if you've never looked at it. And that footage is kind of it's amazing in some regard and gruesome in others. So artists, though, that what's really going on is that a lot of artists were also soldiers, or even if they were artists beforehand, they're experiencing war. And so we see a lot of images come up that really start to speak to sort of the social activism of the war, and this being sort of comic, right? Like, here's this panel of doctors and yet still deeming that this individual is good enough to go to the front, right? That they'll send any other individual besides the generals and the aristocrats and stuff around them. So this theme of war really has never changed, but this is George Gross's sort of comical take on it. But um, the I can't really pronounce it in German, but in English it means this movement's called like the new objectivity, or the Neue, yes, Sachlichkeit, right, something like that. But anyway, many artists were in the military though, and were able to give sort of their firsthand accounts of the images that they created. A lot of them were associated with Dada for a bit, and then used their works after the war to express sort of the horror and frustration of the war. Gross did that, especially for his country. Um, and a lot of them believed that militarism and capitalism were the cause of all these problems. So they really attacked sort of the corporate and then the banks and everything, as you'll see here in his painting, right? And it shows military and capitalism going on, right? We have, the individual whispering in the ear of the general telling what to do, right? With the headless heads of state, really, but lots of symbolism going on. So lots of satire, and pretty easy to see sort of the blind democracy and just sort of like feeding in cash, and the war machine as it's going on. Other artists really just are showing just the absolute horror. Max Beckman, when you look at this piece, it's something you really can't get out of your mind. It shows his dissolution of the war, and he actually supported it first. Max Beckman was one that supported it. He was a soldier. He used actually himself, his wife, and his son as the model for this painting, which I think is very awkward, very hard. I don't know if I could do that with my family members, but maybe it helped to bring sort of that extra emotion to it. But once he served, then he started to see how awful this sort of the situation was, and sort of that it wasn't about um, country or pride. It was about there was somebody gaining it from the end. Um, the same with Otto Dix, and we've seen altarpieces before already, and so he's using that Northern Renaissance style of these altarpieces, but creating us new panels that are not about Christ. They are not about even religion. They are just all about sort of death. We actually see sort of a reference to that. You imagine that Christ-like figure that was covered in thorns and sores from the Ghent altarpiece. That same idea, the death below, right? Memento mori, but everything here is about death. Otto Dix is actually a veteran of World War One and World War Two. He was not able to escape either of them. He just shows all the death and horror of it in it. He did a series of World War One portraits that where a lot of the sitters were wounded from the new weapons that were being used, chemicals and machine guns, um, and so you had these just very disturbing portraits of individuals, and burnt and missing parts of their face, and was true to the sitter, and that's some of his more famous works. Um, Surrealism, the war has ended, the Roaring Twenties, and now all of a sudden we get the crash, right? And surrealism really was influenced by the writings of Sigmund Freud and the ideas of dreams, dream journals, and um, Salvador Dali is the most famous household name of them. And I put some videos, and I even put some of his own videos that he made on your Moodle shell, just to sort of see how he used any and every medium. He's known for his paintings, but he did prints, he did sculptures, he did film. He was also later, he was very commercial, and he basically sold his name and image to be marketed for toothpaste. He would do toothpaste ads and things like that. But he was in the Dada movement and came over to surrealism. He really wanted to depict the outer reality and the dream world, and he kept many dream journals in order to do this. There's naturalistic surrealism, which uses dreams and nightmares, which is what Dali and another artist, Magritte, are going to use. And then we also have another part of it's called biomorphic surrealism, which is used or created without conscious control. And we'll see that with Jean Miro. And but Dali uses many mediums, like I said, and he's just an interesting character. What we see here, a lot of symbolic features, ants on the clock that represent death to him. You'll see a lot of ants and insects in his pieces, and just a total sort of subversion of the landscape and space where things that, like this tree looks like it should be in the middle ground, but really it's in the foreground. And then there really is no horizon back here. And we got this elevated plane that is at a mirror, is at water, right? We actually have his face here that's been sort of shredded off. But we have all these sort of melting clocks, right? This is a sort of time standing still, and each one's set to the same. The other in that is Magritte. Was really, I actually really enjoy him because this one called The Treachery of Images, because it's a joke. It says that this is not a pipe. And what he's talking about is sort of the idea of semiotics. And semiotics is this: you have signs in words, you have signifiers, and so yes, it's a visual of a pipe, but no, it's not a real pipe. So it's a sort of double entendre there, and that's what he's playing with. Now, he has other works that are very directly related to more surrealistic images. Usually like people with like a sort of a missing face, but there's clouds, behind them, and people in top hats or bowler hats. And you've all seen these on posters and stuff before, but this is one of my more famous or favorite ones. Sculptors in surrealism, Merit Oppenheim, and probably the most famous piece, and one of the more famous sculptures of all time is this teacup and fur. It was actually inspired from a conversation with Picasso. And what's awesome about this is, she is really making a name for herself in a male-dominated world, especially within these movements. We don't see too many female artists. Paul Klee is one that would be on the side of the other. He's the biomorphic surrealist, and what we see here is sort of the representation of the non-visible world. I sought clues to deeper humanity through shapes and colors and formal elements. So there's representation, but it's very childlike, whimsical, and it's sort of kind of crude, right? When we see sort of all these other markings and stuff, and we wonder like, well, what's that about? Why is that? Is that just smearing of the ink, or is that purposeful? And how's that working? But sometimes he would smear the ink and then use that to sort of help inform the drawing. Another movement called De Stil. They're very much like the supremacists and constructivists that we looked at in Russia, but it's called the style, right? That's really what that means. And they're also about utopian ideas, but they want to seek this sort of like visual balance with simple elements. Mondrian is the biggest name, and he'll even make more of a name for himself when he moves to New York City to escape the war. He wanted no single objectivity in his work and just wanted pure plastic. So it's flat, it's basic color, stuff that's straight out of the tube. It's not mixed. There's no real feeling with it. And that's why it kind of works. We see this style work for architecture, stained glass windows, this clothing design, right? So Piet Mondrian really sort of inspires a lot of other craft-based works. The futurists. just kind of like how we saw um, earlier artists want to deal with like technology and speed. Right now, we're doing that again with Brancusi's piece here, and the link there is really a great representation of his work and how he just surrounded his life not only with his work but with art, and to see the simplicity in design. Bauhaus is really sort of, it's a school that informs a lot of design. It's a elements, right? We're used to seeing schools that are about like drawing the nude and drawing the figure, but this is about design. So we get a lot of architects and stuff, but it influences a whole generation of artists that then, of course, the Bauhaus gets shut down when we get closer to World War II. But all those artists then take their ideas into New York and really sort of start uh, inspiring others, especially like Frank Lloyd Wright and such. Um, what's also going on across is that we have a whole other part of the United States, really. And when we think of sort of what's happening on the East Coast and then what's happening on the West, and uh, and in the West, we're going to get into some of the like Mexican muralists and such that are coming through and also inspiring a lot of the American artists. So, but first, on the East Coast, we have Edward Hopper. You've probably seen a lot of posters and such of this. It's a very famous piece, and we have this sort of like quiet scene in the evening. We don't really know what's going on, whether the individuals, what their relationship with one another, but he was a painter and printmaker. Um, and he showed the American landscape as sort of quiet and still and unmoving. And of course, this is a time during the war, right? Things are sort of vacant and things are sort of making it by. Um, most of the images are inspired by the mood during the Great Depression, and uh, right, you can imagine something like the time during the coronavirus, and you're not allowed to be out on the streets and such like that. And so, there's a little bit of new context that we could add to this piece. But he really is a master of suspending time, right? When we look at this, there's a loneliness and isolation that runs through the work, but not like really in a depressing way, right? Those people are not completely alone, right? They do have each other. They seem to be interacting, even though the place itself seems pretty dead. Um, Another sort of scene of everyday life, Jacob Lawrence. He does this. He creates this long series of the migration of the Negro. That this is just one panel, and it shows sort of the everyday life for African American. Right, we can see that this piece is about segregation, um, and he's inspired through the Harlem Renaissance. But this is just one of 60 of those pieces, and he's still, working away, really in this same theme. Uh, he's really showing discrimination on a lot of levels, and using his art to really sort of speak out way before we even had civil rights movement. He's painting both the sort of north and the south images in these works are in this series, and so we get sort of that idea of like, well, this is what you may think of in the north, but here's also what else is going on in the world in the United States. So the regionalists, this piece, of course, very, very famous, and Grant Wood is considered the father of the movement. And these are artists that really rejected the city scene. They believe that they can make just as valid work about their Midwest area, their hometowns. In fact, he writes this treaty called Revolt Against the City that really sort of underscores the values that the regionalists are going for. He's painting in Iowa in the Midwest, and shows sort of a different side of the United States. It's not all skyscrapers and cities and things like that. In this piece, he actually used his dentist and his sister to create sort of the icon there, the pose that's going on. And many believe this is sort of like a nationalism propaganda piece, and it was painted during the Great Depression, so it could have represented fortitude and strength. But some Midwesterners actually thought it was making fun of them, right? Like this is some sort of joke. So there's sort of like a double entendre again here. We don't really know, but there's a lot of symbolism within the piece too that you need to check out within that YouTube link that talks about sort of the windows behind them and posture and poses and the clothing and the choices that Grant Wood makes. Another one of the most famous regionalists is Thomas Hart Benton. He's painting in Missouri and shows both the positive and negative aspects of Missouri's history. Um, these murals are actually sort of mimicked. If you've ever watched the show Parks and Recreation, they have these sort of kind of terrible murals of their hometown history, and they're sort of making the way that Thomas Hart Benton's doing this. Right, we have all the images that kind of go through here that show that yeah, they used slaves, and yes, they were not so nice to Native Americans and stuff. So he put all that on these walls, and all these are in like courthouses and such. So pretty bold statement for the artist to do. A lot of these artists, though, are kind of working in tandem in sort of like a socialist vein, and the Mexican muralists specifically are using socialism within their work. And I put a YouTube video on Moodle about uh, Jose Clemente's work, and he's really creating images about Mexico's past. Usually it's political in their work and showing like the working class and the revolution, the ideas of revolution. And he painted these both in Mexico and the U.S. So it that to me is a very interesting point that allowed images, especially when you look in closely here and you sort of have the sort of the white generals, right, and sort of the symbolism that they can take on. But it's very graphic style. He portrayed the politics. There's a lot of satire, a lot about history and propaganda, war, love, and I mean, he puts everything he can into his pieces to leave no stone unturned for what life is really like. One of the most famous, though, and similar to Clemente in the subject matter, is Diego Rivera. And of course, he is a part of the Socialist Party, and he too paints in the U.S. and Mexico. He studied Italian fresco, so he's very well versed. In fact, I remember seeing a Cubism show of his in the National Gallery in D.C. one year, and I was just sort of amazed that he tried a lot, he traveled a lot, so he's very well versed stylistically on what to do. Um, his images of Mexican Revolution and Mexico's fight for independence are really his central themes. And we also know him because of his wife being Frida Kahlo, and sort of the weird love relationship that they had, and just sort of how tormented they were for each other and to each other. And speaking of her, here's her piece. Now, she's actually considered a little bit more of like a surrealist, but Frida has a very interesting path into art. You may have seen the film of her that's where Selma Hayek plays her. I did put a video there that talks a little bit more, but she's used her in her works, all of herself, a lot of portraits of herself, and all of it very symbolic. She had a very terrible accident that damaged her body and kept her in a hospital bed. And that's where she taught herself how to paint. She was actually in a bus, and the bus crashed, ejected, and she landed, and it was impaled through her genitals and then up out of her back on a signpost. And so because of that, she couldn't have children. She had several miscarriages. She always wanted to have children, a large family, but couldn't. So in a lot of her works, there's stand-ins for those children. Usually they're animals. So she collected a lot of animals, monkeys, and such that were really her children. But like I said, she was labeled a surrealist, but she didn't run with that crowd. Only stylistically did people sort of make the connection, but she never tried to be a surrealist. She's really deep into her Mexican heritage, and this sort of like two Fridas that is shown here shows that identity crisis because native culture and Spanish influences. Her parents were Mexican and German, so she has this idea of being very true native and at the same time someone who doesn't belong. So that's what we're kind of seeing going on here. Photography and how it was used in this time really sort of was kept going by the Works Project Administration and FDR's New Deal, which was to get Americans back to work. And with that, a lot of artists were sent out to sort of document the American landscape. And this is, of course, the Great Depression. And Dorothea Lange yeah, she works for the Farm Security Administration, which is like the Works Project. But these artists were paid to go around the country and just show that life. Other people were paid to build interstate roads and dams and all that sort of stuff. But her task was really to show the living conditions of rural America and migrant workers. These images were used in the press to help make social change. And people, because of this image specifically, became very aware of the labor camps that had formed from all the people, moving to California looking for work, and how people were starving, how people were living in such states of despondency. But yeah, so this work is very important for us because it really sort of like elevate to the entire United States, like, wow, this is what we're dealing with. Sculpture. So Alexander Calder creates these, what we now know as mobiles, and we think of them even as what hangs above a child's bed and sort of spins around. And it's actually, the name I put there is given by Duchamp, but these are really sort of interesting pieces that hadn't been made before, based off of just balance. They're inspired by Mondrian's work that we saw in the De Stijl movement, and uh, Alexander Calder actually has a mechanical engineering background, and he gets to start in art by making these little tiny wire people and then trying to make them move. And he really liked putting on little circus shows. So you can find videos of him making these little tiny wire horses and people, and like making all these like little tiny circus performances. But what he's really known for is these mobiles. So, and here we are again, the last slide in this chapter, architecture. Frank Lloyd Wright again, defining another sort of generation of workforces with this movement, and he's really an icon of modernist architecture. This is used, actually was built as a weekend retreat for a department store manager, which is amazing considering the time, and thinking that, like, wow, how did he have the money? But anyway, and what Frank Lloyd Wright did is he really incorporated the house into the landscape. He's interested in organic architecture, and so he builds this thing right over the waterfall, and the house extends in all four directions all around. So you kind of get this idea of sort of hovering above that space. This really gave him international credit, and put American architects on the map of capable architects. And the YouTube link goes into further detail about it. So thank you very much for getting through this chapter. Take a look at the notes, and don't forget to do the quiz.